Welcome everyone. Great to see a full room here in Chicago. I'm Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's a real honor to, thank you. All right, we're done, thanks. That's it. Mr. Vice President, we're really honored to have you and your wife, Karen Pence, joining us here today. We're so honored to have you to be with us here in person and on screen for the rest of the world to be watching and participating. This is an on-the-record program. We are live streaming it through the Council YouTube page. Here's what we're going to do. The Vice President and I will engage in a conversation about 20, 25 minutes. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. There will be a microphone in the room. Queue up behind it, and we'll get to you. And for those who are watching us remotely, go to ccga.live, type in your question, and we'll get to it that way as well. Vice President Pence afterwards will be signing copies of his book, so please do stay around for that as well. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to remind everyone that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan organization, and that the views expressed by speakers on our platform are their own and do not reflect the views of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm honored to introduce Vice President Pence. Mike Pence served as the 48th Vice President of the United States. He was the 50th Governor of the state of Indiana. He served as a member of the House of Representatives. Welcome, Vice President Pence. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. An honor to be here. Thank you all.
So I want to start with an easy question. Are you running for president in 2024?
Well, first, just let me thank you and thank the Council for hosting us here today. It's good to be back in Chicago. If you take time to read So Help Me God, you'll find out that I am the son of a combat veteran and a precocious, red-headed, first-generation Irish American who both grew up on the south side of Chicago. In many ways, this great city was our second hometown when I was growing up. We'd drive up from a small town in Indiana every holiday to visit family, and I'm proud to say that with not only with my wife alongside, but with my niece and her wonderful husband, Chris Doolin. Lauren and Chris are with us. They live here in Chicago, so very special place, and it's wonderful to be back. I also want to thank a great colleague of mine in the Congress of the United States who served with enormous distinction, Congressman Bob Daalder. I want to thank you for being here and being part of the Council's event. Well, let me answer your question as forthrightly as I can, and that is to say I'm always humbled to be asked. The first time I got asked that question, I'd been in Congress for about 10 years. I was showing up a fair amount on C-SPAN and on cable television, and people started to ask me if I ever thought about running for president. And I said, no more, no less than anybody else that grew up with a cornfield in his backyard. I mean, I kind of thought that was part of what it was to be an American, to dream big dreams. And so the dream of public service has really been the calling of our life. After 3 times trying, as you could read, I finally got elected to the Congress some 22 years ago, served for 12 years. Never imagined I'd be able to be governor of the state that my family moved to before I was born. And you can imagine the incredible sense of the privilege I had the day I raised my right hand to become the 48th Vice President of the United States. But for us all along the way, I can honestly tell you, Ivo, that for us it's always about what our sense of calling is. You've been kind enough to acknowledge her, but it's not only a joy to be back in Chicago, but it really is a joy to be with my incredible wife, Karen, who I think was the best second lady the United States of America has ever had. For us, a friend of mine told me many years ago, he said, there's 2 kinds of people in Washington, D.C. There's people that are called and people that are driven. And I've been both, to be honest with you. If you read in the book, early on in my political career, I allowed my ambition to overrun what I thought my faith actually expected of me in the public square. But when it came back around a decade later, we sought to align our public life with our private convictions. And However imperfectly, we've sought to do that ever since. But responding to a calling is how we've tried to make our decisions. So this coming Christmas, Karen and I will have our kids home for the first time in 3 years. We have 2 in active duty military. My son's a captain in the Marine Corps. One of my unworthy son-in-laws is a lieutenant in the Navy. And they'll all be home in Indiana for the first time in 3 years in between deployments. And we're going to take some time to give prayerful consideration, conversation as a family. But I promise I'll keep you posted, Ivo, and but we'll go where we're called. I want people to know that'll be how we search our hearts and how we answer that question after the first of the year.
So I take that's not a no. But, may not be a yes, but no, I think that's fair enough. I think you laid it out exactly. If you do run or not, just one more question. If the president you serve with, Donald Trump, has announced that he's running.
I heard that.
You must have heard that. It's difficult to miss it in some ways. If he is the Republican nominee, would you support him?
Well, let me say, as you implied, there may be somebody else in the field I prefer more. But I will tell you, I honestly think we're going to have better choices in 2024, and I trust Republican primary voters to sort it out. Let me say emphatically, though, I don't think anyone else could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. And I learned that along the way. If you read So Help Me God, you'll hear that I actually endorsed another candidate in the Indiana primary in 2016. And in all fairness, Ted Cruz won all 3 counties I campaigned with him in. Donald Trump won the other 89. So I think Republican voters chose wisely in 2016. They put a fighter on the field, somebody that could go up against a decades-long political organization that had elected a president, had seen a Secretary of State rise, and was on the verge of electing a president again. And but I think in this coming election cycle, I think the American people, as I've heard the last 2 years, I think they want to get back to the policies that resulted in a stronger, more prosperous, more secure America during the Trump-Pence years. But what I hear people telling me everywhere I go is that they long for leadership that could unite our country around our highest ideals. And chief among those is civility and mutual respect. You know, having been out of politics now for almost 2 years, traveling across the country, you're reminded about the fact that while our politics is very divided today, I'm not convinced the American people are as divided as our politics. The truth is, most Americans, as I'm sure many in this room and looking on just proved at the Thanksgiving table, most Americans figure out how to get along pretty well with people that they don't agree with on everything. And I think what I hear is that in this time, that voters, and particularly in the Republican primary voters that I hear from, are looking for new leadership, and leadership that will be more reflective of that aspiration of the American people. And so I think we'll have better choices, and I look forward to supporting that candidate.
Thanks. I think that's clear too, in its own way. Let's get to your book and some of the issues. And one of the issues you describe in great detail, the events of January 6th. I think we all agree that you showed incredible courage that day in both insisting on staying put at the Capitol and insisting that the democratic process be completed as soon as possible. So first of all, I want to thank you for that, sir.
Thank you.
You talk about the fact that your family was there. There was a personal fear, which is understandable, and luckily none of us were in the position you were, the three of you and so many others. But did you fear for our democracy that day?
Well, Ivo, first, thank you for the generous comments and the affirmation from people gathered here. Look, January 6th was a tragic day. But thanks to the courage of law enforcement, Capitol and federal, the violence was quelled, order was restored, and with the support of Republican and Democrat leaders in the Congress, we reconvened the Congress the very same day and completed our work for the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution of the United States. And it was my honor to be a small part of that. Now you mentioned you mentioned the sense of fear or anxiety, but I must tell you, as I wrote in the book, I think by God's grace that day, I was not afraid. I had great confidence in the Capitol Hill Police. I had great confidence in our Secret Service team. But I was angry. I was angry at what I saw unfolding at the Capitol. Like the congressman, I'd served there for many years. I had dreamed since I was a boy of someday representing my hometown in the Congress. And when I looked at those scenes coming across the phones and on the small television set in my Senate ceremonial office, as I wrote, I was filled with a simmering indignation. I just thought, not this, not here, not in America. And I was determined to put aside whatever emotions I was feeling and just work the problem. When a tweet came across sometime after 2 p.m., as a riot was raging in the hallways of the Congress, a tweet the president had sent out referring to me in a critical manner, it was clear to me he had decided to be a part of the problem in that moment. I was determined to be a part of the solution. And that was when we got the Speaker and Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell and Leader McCarthy on a call, and we just started to work the problem. And I just must tell you that, and again, it was by God's grace and with the extraordinary people around me that we were able, I don't think, to do any more or any less. We just did our duty that day. And my hope in writing the book is that people understand not only why I did what I did, but how we did it. And because in that moment, I do believe that my faith, my family, my upbringing, and my years in public service prepared us for that moment. But I'm very humbled by your kindness and the warm welcome here.
But the events, as you said, you were angry over the events. Wasn't helped by the person sitting in the Oval Office or right next to it at the time. And it does raise, and it has raised this question about whether our democracy is stronger today, or is it indeed fragile? Is it something we ought to worry about more than we may have before, that we've taken too many things for granted, that we've assumed customs and norms were sufficient?
Well, I think it's a very good question and a very fair question. And I would say this. Number one, as I said when we reconvened the Congress that day, commending all the Republicans and Democrats that had gathered back on the Senate floor, I said, today the world will witness the resilience of our democracy when members of both political parties reconvene and finish our work. And the world did witness that. But I will tell you that I do think that not just in the 2 months preceding January 6th, but in the years preceding January 6th, the rhetoric about a stolen election. I know the president made that assertion. Others around him made that assertion. The election was stolen. It wasn't a legitimate election. I wish that was the first time I heard that. Because the truth is that Hillary Clinton spent much of the previous 4 years saying that the election was stolen. She said more times than I can remember that the president was not the legitimate president of the United States. And actually, Democrats had filed objections in the last 3 presidential elections where a Republican had prevailed. even though there was no evidence of fraud in those states that would have changed the outcome. And I think the collective efforts of that is something that we ought to think about as a country, and we ought to think about across party lines. Look, members of Congress have every right, members of the House, the Senate, candidates for president, to challenge election outcomes in the courts. And under the Electoral Count Act, they have the right to bring objections. But I think once the process is settled out, I think we would do well if we had leaders in both political parties that stood up and accepted the results of elections and went and fought in the years ahead on the issues until the next election comes around, instead of undermining confidence in elections, as has occurred since the election in 2020 and in the months that followed that tragic day, but was occurring in the 4 years before. I think we ought to bring all of that rhetoric to an end. We ought to channel concern about elections into legitimate legal processes, and ultimately do everything we can to ensure the integrity of the vote for all the American people.
We are Council on Global Affairs, not that America's and its democracy is not important from a global perspective, so it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it. And while most Americans care about who their president is, much of the world does too, so it's not irrelevant to what we're doing. But let's turn to the to some of the foreign policy issues. I want to start with China. You write in your book that one of the defining features of Donald Trump's candidacy was his willingness to speak truth about America's role and relationship with China. And he did indeed change it, and you yourself contributed with a major speech at the Hudson Institute on this. And I wanted to get your perspective of where you think China is today in terms of the challenge it represents, and whether we're prepared as a country to deal with the competition that China, or the challenge that China, however you want to phrase it, represents today.
Well, Ivo, I'm probably more proud of the fact that the Trump-Pence administration changed the national consensus on China than any other aspect of our foreign policy. And the realization that China represents the greatest economic and strategic threat to the United States in the 21st century, evidenced by your work, evidenced by statements by prominent Democrats and Republicans, is virtually universal in the Congress today. And I think that's incredible progress. Without the COVID pandemic striking as it did from China, I think we were on track to begin to bring China forward in terms of opening its markets to the West. If you remember, it's long since forgotten, but in January of 2020, before we had, as a nation, even become aware of the coronavirus, we signed a phase one trade deal, $250 billion in tariffs that we'd imposed on China after years of intellectual property theft, years of trade abuses, aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, oppression of Muslim Uyghurs and Christians and other religious minorities. We said enough is enough. We're gonna take a strong stand, and we did. And I'm grateful the Biden administration has not undone any of those tariffs. But I think that absent COVID, China was beginning to come our way in terms of starting to stand down some of the unfair trade practices that they had put into effect since becoming part of the World Trade Organization. And but I think you need look no further than the streets of Beijing today to know that this is a very, I think, critical time, both in China and our relationship with China. And I think it's absolutely essential that we continue to stand firm, that we continue to speak plainly about human rights abuses. I think it's important that the United States speak out in favor of people in China who are standing up for freedom and fair elections, and to end the oppression of the zero COVID policies there. But I'm absolutely convinced that we can have a peaceful future in the relationship between the United States and China, but it will depend on whether we define that relationship first with strength, with a commitment to the Asia-Pacific in terms of national security, standing with our allies in the region, ensuring freedom of navigation, and if we continue to stand firm and demand that we are going to continue to restrict access to the most powerful economy in the world until China begins to stand down on intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. But it'll require strength.
You mentioned the protests that are really seeming to spread throughout cities in China. And there is this real problem that the Chinese government has. It can't, on the one hand, open up the society because the vaccines they have aren't good enough and there's no immunity because COVID hasn't really gotten through to society yet. And the healthcare system just isn't able to cope, as we saw even in our own situation, and the situation is likely to be worse. And yet, there's now this rallying cry against the COVID lockdown. How do you think the Chinese government, this Chinese government, and you've dealt with them, is likely to respond to this protest? How are they going to get out of this catch-22 that they're, in some ways, have put themselves in?
Well, I just couldn't have more respect for people that are taking to the streets in China today. I mean, China is the largest police state in the world, and the technology it uses now to track its citizens means that people that are in the streets are risking their liberties, maybe more, and the liberties of their families. And I fear, based upon what we saw in Hong Kong, that there will be a strong, overwhelming effort simply to silence dissent. And but my hope is that that the American administration will speak out. You know, I was in Congress back in 2009 when the Green Revolution happened in Iran. And we were waiting on President Obama to speak out in behalf of people that were taken to the streets in Iran, clamoring for free, fair elections and democracy. And when he did not, I reached out to Howard Berman in the Congress, a Democrat, and John McCain reached out, the late John McCain, to Joe Lieberman in the Senate. We passed resolutions almost unanimously standing with the people in the Green Revolution in Iran, and it was after that that President Obama then spoke out. And frankly, I was very moved that in an interview recently, President Obama said among the things he regretted was that he hadn't spoken out sooner when people were still in the streets. And I am hopeful that President Biden will take that counsel, if not from me, then from the president with whom he served. And let America speak out, and speak out on behalf of people in China who, while I think that the precipitating cause of the demonstrations is the zero COVID policy, what I'm reading in the international press today, Ivo, is that many people are also talking about democracy and talking about freedom, and they ought to at least know that as was the case in the old Soviet Union, that there were people in America that were cheering them on, praying for them, and hoping for the day that the good people of China can live in freedom and liberty.
We're going to open up to questions pretty soon, so if you have a question in the room, why don't you line up behind the microphone, and for those online, go to ccga.live and type in your question there, and we'll get to it. Vladimir Putin, you write in your book that you met him. He seems taken aback when you told him not to meddle in the American elections. Tell us a little bit more about Vladimir Putin, your impression of the man, and has he changed given what he is inflicting on the people of Ukraine? Or was this something that you thought was already there, and we should have figured out a better strategy to counter it before it happened?
Well, Ivo, I never had any illusions about Vladimir Putin. I know that President Bush said that he looked into his eyes and saw his soul, and I know that President Obama hoped for better things. But from my years on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, watching Russian tanks roll into the country of Georgia, watching them take over Crimea. I felt like I knew what we were looking at there. And I must tell you, it is a source of pride to me that the Trump-Pence administration was the only administration in the 21st century where Russia did not try to redraw international lines by force. And I don't think that was a coincidence. I think it was, despite the fact that President Trump always was trying to signal that the door was open to a better relationship, it was our administration that unleashed the American military to take down the ISIS caliphate. We sent 2 rounds of cruise missiles into Syria when they used chemical weapons. We took out the ISIS leader without one American casualty, and we took out Qasem Soleimani, the most dangerous terrorist in the world. I think the credible threat of the use of force was there in our administration, and Putin didn't test us. I write about it, and so help me God, but I was actually sent to Eastern Europe in our very first year in office. It was the Zaybad exercise. There were literally 120,000 Russian troops along the border of Eastern Europe. And the team made the decision to send me in just to fly the flag in a couple of those countries and reiterate our strong support for our allies in the region. So do I think that Putin has changed? No. But my instinct is, having stood toe-to-toe with him for a brief encounter and seen him at an international conference, is that Putin only understands strength. And that right now, and I want to appreciate you and appreciate the Council for your strong voice for Ukraine. Now more than ever, we need leaders in both political parties who make it clear that the United States of America is going to make sure the courageous people in Ukraine have the resources and support they need to fight and win their country back. And I promise you that I'll be a voice for that. That's what Putin will respect.
I appreciate that, and couldn't agree more. This is not a partisan issue. This is truly an American issue, as so many foreign policy issues are. Final question before opening up the door.
Well, may I add to that?
Yeah, sure.
You know, there was, I started out in politics as a Democrat. I mean, we don't just have the same color hair in common. Ronald Reagan drew me to the Republican Party, son of Illinois. There was something called the Reagan Doctrine back in the day. And I am determined to remind my Republican colleagues in the Congress who have a kind of concern about providing resources to Ukrainian fighters, is that the Reagan Doctrine was, if you're willing to fight the communists in your country, we'll give you the means to fight them, so we don't have to fight them. It's a very kind of muscular American foreign policy thought, and I'm determined to help communicate that to our colleagues. As I don't think for one second, if Putin found a way to continue his merciless assault on the civilian population in Ukraine, to where he could take the whole country, I don't think there's any way he stops there. I mean, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, they're all just as attractive, just as much within the sphere that he believes the old Soviet Union lost. And so I think the way that we stop that advance is an unambiguous message of support from the West, beginning with the United States.
Couldn't agree more. Mentioning Reagan actually is a good segue to my next question, which is on trade. Because, of course, Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan was a stalwart free trade party. Indeed, NAFTA and TPP started as Republican projects in Republican administrations. President Trump had a different view on trade. And you write in the book that in some ways he convinced you that we needed a different approach to trade than the one that had so defined, particularly the Republican Party, but in some ways a bipartisan consensus for so long. Why have that change in trade at a time when we are using these agreements to try to compete more effectively with countries? What's the rationale for the change?
Well, I always believe that trade means jobs. And here in the Midwest, where we make things, we grow things, we sell them to the world. I was raised to appreciate and understand that. And but I must tell you, during my years in Congress, where I saw almost entire communities shuttered, factories closed, thousands of jobs lost, moved south of the border to Mexico. You've seen the same happen here in Illinois. We've seen it across the Midwest. I mean, literally thousands of factories closed. I began to rethink my reflexive support for free trade. And the thing that I'm very proud of in our administration is, for all the president's strong stand on trade deals that put American jobs and American workers first, with that attitude, our administration signed into law the largest trade deal in American history, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which has contributed mightily to our economy already, and helped level the playing field that had created the incentives for companies to be moving jobs, particularly south of the border. We did a trade deal with South Korea, the updated the Chorus Agreement. We were in negotiations with the UK. We were in negotiations with the EU. But it began from the standpoint of that the president persuaded me on, that you have to come into it understanding that the people on the other side of the table are going to be advancing the interest of their citizens and their workers, and you got to make it clear to them you're going to do exactly the same thing, and that the deal has to first win for your people. And whereas much of the Republican orthodoxy, to your point, and I thought it was well stated, Republican orthodoxy before that was that free trade is a good thing, and however imperfect. But I think the people that were paying the price for that were many of the people that rallied around our team and our ticket. 74 million votes in 2020, 10 million more than we got in 2016. There's a lot of disaffected Americans who felt left behind by, in particular, trade deals and economic policies that we're not putting them first. And so I do think that that while we built on that Reagan platform, that Reagan agenda, I do think, whether it was our view of China, whether it was a view of having a secure border, that the other issue that the Trump-Pence administration added to the national debate in our party was the commitment that trade must be free and fair for it to work for every American.
Thank you, sir. Let's open up the questions here in the room, and we'll have a question here, and then we'll also get some from folks online.
Mr. Vice President, and I must say, Mr. Heroic Vice President, you say frequently that the law applies equally to every American. When it comes to being a material witness, are there exceptions, and should there be exceptions?
Well, I think it depends on what the setting is, I think. You know, it was much in the news recently that I made it clear that I had no intention of testifying before the January 6th committee in the Congress. But my reasons for that spring from several things. Number one, I was very concerned from the very beginning of a committee in Congress that was appointed entirely by the Democrat Speaker of the House. That was actually anathema to me for my 12 years in Congress. That Congress operates on a bipartisan basis. There's representation on committees. And to have the Speaker of the House appoint every member of that committee, I thought was a missed opportunity. Secondly, I didn't stand in the way of members of my senior staff testifying before the committee, providing them relevant information. But when it came to me, I made it clear that given the profound constitutional issues that arise in the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch that Congress had no right to my testimony. In fact, I think it would establish a terrible precedent to actually, for the first time in American history, to have the Congress be able to summon a vice president to speak about private deliberations with the president at the White House. I think it would undermine the relationship between a president and vice president for generations. And so, as I said, we sought to provide the relevant information. It was a tragic day, but I wanted to stand on what I might perceive to be the requirements of the Constitution and upholding and preserving the unique aspects of the office in which I served.
Just a quick personal concern. That's a good reason. But what if every American had the same reason, or some reason, or any reason? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the rest of that.
I would. Not every American is vice president of the United States, which makes it kind of different.
I got you.
It has to do with.
But every American is something and somebody.
Yeah, there's a constitutional issue between those two things. But anyway, let's. What I want to do is actually go to a question that came over to Transom, this wonderful thing called the internet, which is, and I wanted to actually ask you about Korea policy and other policy where the president, in particular, made some novel moves. And so the question is, if you were president, would you meet with Kim Jong-un?
Well, for years and you know this better than most, from your time in the administration, we run kind of a cycle with Kim Jong-un and his father and his grandfather, which was provocations followed by concessions by the West with empty promises. The promises were then broken, and then the provocations started again. And in our administration, we took a completely different approach. President Trump said the door's open for discussions, but there's going to be no accommodations. There'll be no sanctions relief. There's nothing in exchange for that. And for a time, early in our administration, there was a lot of rhetoric flying back and forth between the two. I remember particularly a threat that came in from North Korea against the continental United States, and the president wrote back memorably on Twitter that I've got a button on my desk and it's bigger than yours and it works. Now, I will tell you, all evidence of everything that I learned about those exchanges that would take place in two successive summits was language that they understood in North Korea. When Karen and I went and represented the United States at the Olympics that took place in Seoul, there was an effort in a very real sense to have us kind of, what my late father from the south side of Chicago used to say, pose for holy pictures. Maybe you don't say that anymore, but there was this push to have some PR moment between me and Kim Jong-un's sister. And we just weren't having it. I wasn't there to socialize with North Koreans. I was there to stand with South Korea and with our freedom-loving allies in the region. And I can tell you that was not well received in Pyongyang either. But the stand that we took and the president's defiant tone ultimately opened the way for dialogue. And I hold the view that dialogue in the main is good. You can explore then where, in a diplomatic context, where there might be possibility for progress. But at the end of the day, after the second summit, when the president ended up leaving early, it was clear that while Kim Jong-un had stopped missile testing, stopped nuclear testing, that he was not prepared to achieve the full verified denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which was our deal breaker. Now, sadly, Kim Jong-un has returned to his provocations, firing a record number of missiles in the last month alone. And to answer your question, if I was ever in a position to make a decision whether a meeting would happen. I think it would be informed by the lack of progress from the last dialogue. I do think we're probably now at a place where Kim Jong-un or whatever his collective group around him is prepared to do, they need to start doing first before there's more dialogue, because it seems to me that we're slipping back into a pattern that does not contribute to the security of the region or advancing that worthy objective of a denuclearized North Korea. So I'd need to see more. I'd need to see more action before any more conversation.
Got time for at least one more question.
Good evening, Mr. Vice President. My name is Rudy Altergott. I'm a longtime member of the council and from this area, but I'm also a Wabash College alum. We have many mutual friends among your fellow Hoosiers. I must tell you, sir, as a more moderate to liberal voter and a religious free thinker, I'm on the other side of a good number of your stances, but many people look to you as a leader of the Republican Party. I would like to ask you what assurances you could give me as somebody who's a proud Midwesterner who loves his country, an Eagle Scout who tries to follow the example of Senator Dick Lugar, yet who frankly has given up on the GOP.
Well, what I could tell you is that during my years as, and I didn't always get along with Wabash people because
You're not like Quayle, who's a DePaul guy.
I was a Hanover College guy. It was not good, particularly during football season. Look, what I can tell you is, for all the challenges we have as a country, during my years in Congress and as governor and as your vice president, my opinion of the American people went up, not down. This is a great country. And Americans are at their best, it seems like, when things are at their worst. I mean, Karen and I had the privilege to go to Sutherland Springs, Texas, after a horrific shooting at a church that took place there. We walked through a cafeteria of families that were absolutely destroyed by what had happened, but we saw neighbors coming alongside them and praying with them and supporting them and helping them. And we saw it in the wake of natural disasters. We saw it in the faces of our soldiers when we went downrange to visit in Afghanistan and Iraq. And frankly, and I write about this in the book, look, there's always lessons learned. I mean, the worst pandemic in 100 years. We ought to be studying it deeply, and we ought to be writing a playbook for America. And but I couldn't be more proud of what the American people accomplished during that pandemic. I mean, if you think about it, with American innovation, we reinvented testing from a standing start. We saw to the distribution and production of billions of medical supplies. And it was American companies, that ingenuity and Operation Warp Speed, that developed 2 safe and effective vaccines in 9 months, when it usually takes 5 to 7 years. The title of that chapter in my book is Only in America. And that was all the American people. And so one of the things I like to say is that we just need to have government as good as our people again. You know, that's as generous, as determined, as creative, as respectful as the American people are with one another. And, you know, we don't have to agree on everything to figure out if there are some things we do agree on. And I just encourage you, I mean, Evo may not appreciate it, don't give up on the GOP. The best is yet to come, I promise you. Thank you.
We run a nonpartisan organization here, so however you want to do that's perfectly fine. I want to end, because unfortunately we're running out of time. Today in the New York Times, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, wrote a wonderful piece about how people who can profoundly differ about a whole series of issues on religion, on peace, on the society, on everything else, were able to form a government And the key to that government was that 70% of the people agreed on 70% of the time. So let's work on those 70% and put the other 30% on hold. I thought that was a fitting way, in this case Israel, but a fitting way to emphasize your point about the American people and a government as good as the people are. I want to thank you for your service, but more importantly, right now for the 45 minutes you spent with us. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I hope the same was for you, despite how we started it off. But thank you for coming to Chicago. You're always welcome here at the council. Come and visit us as much as you want. And if you do run for president, let us know. We'll give you we'll do a debate here, or at least we'll give you a Q&A in order to delve more deeply into foreign policy. For now, though, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bess. And thank you all.